This is the brutal story of how a pop star who was at the highest of heights was kidnapped, put onto a plane and taken to a different country. They disappeared without a trace for almost 10 years. This is the story of Amy Ann Duffy. Amy Ann Duffy was born on the 23rd of June 1984, and her birthplace was Bangor, North Wales. Duffy grew up with her parents, John and Joyce. She had two sisters, and she also had an identical twin called Katie. Duffy's parents unfortunately divorced when she was 10 years old. And so ultimately, she moved with her mother and her sisters to the town of Pembrokeshire. Music, it said, was a massive part of her childhood, and she became interested in singing from a very young age. She was drawn to the soul and pop music of the 1960s, and eventually that became her trademark sound. It's important to touch on Duffy's early life, so her teenage life, to see how she got to the point of stardom and what ultimately happened for her to disappear for 10 years when she was at the ultimate peak. Well, as advised, when Duffy was 10 years old, her parents sadly divorced, and Duffy went on to live with her mother and her sisters. Her mother subsequently met another partner, and between the age of 10 to 15 years old, this in itself is where the difficulties really began for Duffy. So Duffy's mother's new partner moved in with Duffy, her mum and her sisters. He also brought along his own children. So you can imagine at the time, it was a very busy household. There was unfortunately a sequence of events that would have a tragic impact on Duffy. So let me break this down for you. So her mum's new partner, his ex-wife, ultimately put a hit out on him. And obviously at the time, he was living with Duffy and her family. Because of this, it was said that Duffy, between the age of 10 to 14, had to move into a safe house. And I know your question. You're going to be thinking, well, how did they find out about this? Well, the person, the hitman that the ex-partner had hired, instead of carrying out this horrendous act, had instead gone to the police. And so Duffy, her sisters, her mother, the partner and his children were ultimately moved into a safe house. And Duffy tells the story on this, how those 3 to 4 years were horrendous. And she explains that despite being in a safe house, she never felt safe at all. Ultimately, because of these issues and college commitments, she moved back in with her dad at age 15. So Duffy and her dad moved to a place called Chester, and Duffy ultimately attended Chester College. Whilst at college, she continued with her interest in music, and she would perform at local restaurants and local pubs. There was a certain jazz club in Chester called Alexandra's, and she would often perform there. And it was said that this was the place that she ultimately developed her skills and talent for singing. Despite being pretty good at singing, she carried on with her studies, and ultimately she went to university. This was subsequently around the year of 2003, and whilst being at university, she had had an insightful lecture with a gentleman who ultimately paved the pathway for her singing career. He pulled her to one side and basically explained to Duffy that she should drop out of university, she should go on to the dole, which the dole for anybody outside of the UK was means tested benefits, so to go on to benefits, which would then in turn open up the ability to pursue her singing career. And that's what she ultimately did. And so in 2003, she entered Wales' version of the X Factor, and she did really well. She actually finished the competition second, losing to a Lisa Pendrick. And so in 2004, Duffy finally got her big break. She was to partner with Jeanette Lee, who was associated with Rough Trade Records, and eventually Jeanette Lee became her manager. The year of 2008 is actually where this story really begins. Duffy released her debut album, Rockferry, with then #1 hit, which I'm sure you'll remember, topped the charts for 5 weeks. So it spent 5 weeks at #1, and then for the rest of the year, it remained in the top 40 hits. It was none other than the song Mercy. She quickly became known for her old-style, powerful soul voice, and she was frequently being compared with singers and pop stars from the 1960s. And in 2009, this is where ultimately all of her hard work finally paid off. She was awarded a Grammy Award for the Best Pop Vocal Album. At this point, it's fair to say that she had really peaked. But something to also remember is she peaked very soon in her singing career. It was only 2008 when she'd released her debut album. And by 2009, she'd already won a Grammy Award. So ultimately, in just a couple of years, she had gone from a young, unknown singer that competed in the Wales version of X Factor to now an international, global superstar. She was really at the peak of her powers. Now, I know what you're thinking. What happened next? Did she win some more awards? Did she go on to release more hit albums or hit singles? No, she disappeared. And she disappeared for almost 10 years. Now, this isn't the story of a pop star hitting the absolute peak, earning a ton of money, and then deciding to run off into the night. Something absolutely horrendous and horrific happened to Duffy. She stopped everything. There were no more songs, no more performances, no more interviews, no more awards. She absolutely disappeared. And it left her fans wondering what had happened to her. In February 2020, this is almost a decade later, she released a statement on her social media account to ultimately divulge to the world that she had been kidnapped, she had been spiked, she had been taken to another country. Horrendous and awful, horrific acts had taken place against her. And she explained that due to her trauma suffered, she felt that she had to come away from music and to step away from the public eye. In March 2026 this year, Disney Plus, who are renowned for creating documentaries, have released a statement to say that later this year in 2026, a documentary of Duffy's life is going to be created and put out there for the viewing world. And within this documentary, they are going to highlight and explain the horrific ordeal of which Duffy went through for almost 10 years. However, let's break down in this video the information that we know already. So Amy Duffy, or as we all know her, Duffy, explains that she had gone out with a friend to a London restaurant. She advised that she was there with a friend and nobody else. So we are set to believe that in this restaurant, there's just Duffy and her friend. Duffy advises that they were eating a meal and during the meal they had had some drinks. Shortly after, Duffy explains that she was quickly becoming disorientated. She had a feeling that something wasn't right, and ultimately she explains that she felt drunk, but she hadn't in fact drunk enough to have the feeling of feeling drunk. She later found out that her drinks that night had been spiked. She goes on to explain that she remembers a male. So at this point, we've got a friend that she'd gone out with, but now a male. It's not understood if the friend was the male, but the purpose of the explanation, she explains that a male had put her into a car, so into a vehicle. The vehicle had driven to an airport, but it's not a normal airport. It's somewhere that bases private aircrafts. She advises that she remembers being in this vehicle and then being transported to an aircraft. She then remembers being flown to another country, yet she doesn't explain which country this was. She then goes on to explain that whilst being in this other country, she was held captive for 3 to 4 weeks, so almost a month. During this time, she goes on to explain that horrific acts, and I'm talking the most horrific acts, were made against her. She then goes on to explain that after 3 to 4 weeks of this horrendous experience, she managed to get away. And so at this point, with limited information, I feel we have more questions than answers. Who was this man? Because again, in statements released by Duffy, she keeps going on about a particular man. Was this man known to her? Was this the friend that she'd gone out with that night? And who's got the capacity to take somebody from a vehicle to a private aircraft and move them to a different country? And at this time, it was said that Duffy was in a relationship. And so why didn't her partner at the time report Duffy missing? I do feel, again, like there's more questions than answers at this point. And I do guess that we're going to learn more about this story when the full documentary is released on Disney+. However, in the meantime, leave me a comment in the comment section down below and tell me, what do you think happened to Duffy?